They say you become what you come from, that your parents live on through your habits, your reactions, your silence. But what if, deep inside, there is a quiet resistance? A fear that whispers, not that, not me. Because sometimes what shaped you also scared you. And the traits you witnessed didn't feel like guidance. They felt like warnings. So you watch yourself closely. You question your tone, your anger, your distance. Is this how it starts? Am I becoming them? This silent fear is rarely spoken about, but it lives in more people than it seems. Tonight we explore why. Let's begin. It rarely begins with something dramatic. Not a life-altering decision. Not a sudden realization, but something small, almost forgettable. A sentence spoken in a certain tone. A moment of impatience. A reaction that feels familiar in a way you didn't choose. And then it hits. Not loudly, not all at once, but quietly, like a shadow moving at the edge of your awareness. That sounded like them. You pause. Maybe you brush it off. But something lingers, because it wasn't just what you said. It was how it felt. The same sharpness, the same withdrawal, the same emotional rhythm you once observed from a distance. And suddenly, the line between them and you feels thinner than it should. Why does recognition feel like this? Why does it carry discomfort instead of familiarity? Because for many, parents are not just figures of guidance. They are also figures of contradiction. They represent warmth and distance, care and confusion, presence and sometimes absence. So when you notice pieces of them within you, it doesn't always feel like inheritance. It feels like risk. A quiet fear begins to form. What if this is how it starts? Not becoming them all at once, but slowly, in unnoticed fragments. You begin to watch yourself more closely. Your reactions are no longer automatic. They are monitored, analyzed, questioned. You replay conversations in your mind, not to understand others, but to examine yourself. Was that too harsh? Too distant? Too familiar? Even your silence begins to feel suspicious, because sometimes the traits you feared were never obvious. They were subtle, passive withdrawal, unspoken tension, emotional distance that didn't look like anger, but felt like absence. And now, when you feel those same patterns rising within you, something tightens. A quiet resistance, not loud enough to stop it, but strong enough to make you aware of it. And awareness can feel like a burden, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to reacting without questioning. You can't pretend it's not there. So you exist in this in-between space. Not fully them, but not entirely free either. Just aware. And sometimes that awareness feels heavier than the behavior itself. Because now, every small moment carries a question. Is this me? Or is this something I inherited? And the answer is never immediate. It lingers, uncertain, uncomfortable, but real. Long before you ever questioned yourself, something was already being written. Not in words, not in clear memories, but in feelings. The way voices sounded in tense moments. The way silence stretched after conflict. The way love was expressed or withheld. These weren't just experiences. They were impressions. And impressions don't fade easily. They settle quietly beneath awareness, like sediment at the bottom of a river. Unseen, but shaping the flow above. As a child, you didn't analyze. You absorbed. You learned what closeness looked like, what distance felt like, what anger meant, what silence meant, even when no one explained it, especially then, because the most powerful lessons are rarely spoken. They are felt. So when a parent withdraws instead of expressing, you learn that distance is safer than vulnerability. When emotions are unpredictable, you learn to stay alert. When warmth comes and goes without warning, you learn not to rely on it. And slowly, without realizing, these patterns become familiar. Not because they are comfortable, but because they are known. This is the quiet paradox. The things that hurt you also become the things your mind recognizes as normal. So even as you grow, even as you promise yourself, I will not be like that. The imprint remains, not as a conscious choice, but as a background setting. And one day, without warning, it shows up. In your reactions, in your tone, in your way of dealing with discomfort. And it feels confusing, because it doesn't match your intention. You wanted to be different. You tried to be different. So why does it still appear? Because intention lives in the present, but imprint lives in the past. And the past doesn't disappear just because you reject it. It stays until it is understood. This is why the fear feels so personal. It's not just about becoming your parents. It's about becoming the parts of your childhood that never felt safe. The tension, the unpredictability, the emotional distance you once wished would end. And now, the possibility that it might live through you feels like a quiet betrayal. But this isn't about weakness. It's about depth. Because only someone who felt those patterns deeply would recognize them so clearly later, would question them, would resist them. And yet, resistance alone doesn't erase imprint. It only makes you more aware of it. And awareness without understanding can feel like being trapped in a cycle you didn't choose. A loop between what you experienced and what you fear becoming. But beneath that fear, there is something else. Something quieter. The realization that these patterns were never truly yours to begin with. They were learned. And what is learned can also be seen. And what can be seen can eventually be understood. There is a quiet truth the mind doesn't often reveal. You don't just remember what you've seen, you become shaped by it. Not intentionally, not consciously, but biologically. Deep within the brain, there exists a system designed for one purpose: to observe and to replicate. Mirror neurons. They activate not only when you act, but when you witness someone else act. As a child, this system is constantly active. Watching, absorbing, recording, not just behaviors, but emotions. The tone of a voice during conflict, the pause before a response, the way tension is handled or avoided. Your brain doesn't ask whether these patterns are healthy. It doesn't pause to evaluate their impact. It simply learns, because learning at that stage is survival. To understand your environment, you must adapt to it. So you mirror what surrounds you, even when it hurts, even when it confuses you. And the deeper the repetition, the stronger the wiring becomes. This is why certain reactions feel automatic. Why, in moments of stress, you don't always choose your response. You fall into it, like a reflex, like something already decided. And afterward, when the moment has passed, you look back and wonder, why did I react like that? Because in that moment, it wasn't just you. It was years of observation, years of silent learning, years of neural pathways reinforcing a pattern. This is where the fear intensifies, because it begins to feel inevitable. If your brain has been shaped this way, if these reactions are wired so deeply, then what control do you really have? Is becoming different even possible? Or are you simply a continuation of what came before? These questions don't come from logic. They come from the feeling of losing control over your own identity. Because when something feels automatic, it doesn't feel like a choice. And when it doesn't feel like a choice, it feels like fate. But the mind is more complex than that. What is wired is not permanent, but it is powerful. And power without awareness feels absolute. This is why recognition matters. Not because it immediately changes anything, but because it interrupts the illusion of unconscious repetition. For the first time, you are not just reacting. You are observing the reaction itself. And that observation creates a pause, a small space, barely noticeable, but significant. Because within that space, something new becomes possible. Not a complete transformation, not instant change, but a shift from automatic to aware. And while awareness may feel heavy at first, it is also the beginning of something else, something quieter, something slower, but something real. The possibility that you are not just what you learned, but someone who can see what they learned. And that difference changes everything. Awareness doesn't bring peace right away. It brings friction, because now there are two forces inside you, one that knows, and one that repeats. You begin to notice it in real time, a reaction rising, and another part of you pulling it back, a thought forming, and another voice questioning it. Feels like standing in the middle of a quiet storm, not visible from the outside, but intense within. You want to respond differently, more calmly, more consciously, but something familiar pulls you in the opposite direction. Not aggressively, not forcefully, but persistently, like a current beneath the surface. And the more you resist it, the more exhausting it becomes, because resistance requires energy. And when that resistance is constant, it begins to wear you down. You start to feel divided, not just in behavior, but in identity. Which one is the real me? The one who reacts instinctively, or the one who questions that reaction? The one shaped by the past, or the one trying to step away from it? There is no immediate answer, only tension, because both feel real. The learned patterns feel natural, familiar, effortless, while the conscious response feels slower, deliberate, sometimes even forced, and this creates doubt. If being better feels unnatural, then is it even authentic? Or is authenticity just another word for what you've always known? This is where many people get stuck, not because they don't want to change, but because change feels like losing something, even if that something once hurt them. Familiarity has a strange comfort, even when it carries pain, because at least it is predictable. At least it doesn't require effort to maintain. But stepping away from it, that feels uncertain, unstable, like walking without knowing where the ground is. So you oscillate between awareness and repetition, between intention and habit. Sometimes you catch yourself in time, sometimes you don't. And when you don't, the disappointment feels heavy, not just because of the reaction, but because it feels like proof that maybe you haven't changed, that maybe you're closer to becoming what you feared than you want to admit. But this is not failure. It only feels like it because the expectation is immediate transformation. And the mind doesn't work that way. It doesn't rewrite itself overnight. It reshapes slowly, through repetition, through awareness, through moments that feel small, but accumulate over time. So this inner conflict, as uncomfortable as it is not a sign that you're losing. It's a sign that something inside you is no longer unconscious. And that awareness, even when it feels like tension, is still movement, still change, still the beginning of something different. There comes a moment, not loud, not dramatic, but quietly different. A moment where something inside you stops resisting and starts noticing, not with fear, but with curiosity. You still recognize the patterns, the tone, the reaction, but this time the feeling isn't immediate panic. It's something else. A pause, a breath that lasts just a little longer. And within that space, a question emerges. Where did this come from? Not as accusation, not as judgment, but as observation. This is the turning point many don't expect. Because for so long, the focus was on avoiding resemblance, escaping it, fighting it. But now something shifts. You begin to see these patterns not as threats, but as traces, echoes of something that once surrounded you. And instead of asking, how do I stop this? You begin to ask, why does this exist in me at all? That question changes everything, because it moves you away from fear and toward understanding. You start to notice context, the moments when these reactions appear, the emotions that come before them, the subtle triggers that once went unseen. And slowly, a pattern within the pattern reveals itself. You realize it isn't random. It follows a rhythm, stress, discomfort, vulnerability, moments where something feels uncertain or unsafe. And in those moments, the mind reaches for what it knows, not what is best, but what is familiar. This is where compassion begins to enter, not as forgiveness for behavior, but as understanding for its origin. Because these patterns didn't form in isolation. They were shaped in environments where certain responses made sense, where silence protected, where distance prevented conflict, where emotional withdrawal felt safer than expression. And once you see that, the reaction begins to lose its mystery. It is no longer a sign of becoming someone else. It is a sign of carrying something that was once necessary, something that stayed, even when it was no longer needed. This realization doesn't erase the pattern, but it softens your response to it. The harsh self-criticism begins to fade. The fear begins to loosen its grip, because now you are not just reacting to the pattern, you are understanding it, and understanding creates space. A space where you are no longer trapped between rejection and repetition, but standing slightly outside it, watching, not as someone trying to escape, but as someone beginning to see clearly. And in that clarity, something important begins to emerge. Not control, not perfection, but awareness without panic. And that alone changes the direction of everything that follows. Change rarely arrives the way people expect it to. Not sudden, not absolute, but gradual, almost invisible at first. Because once awareness replaces fear, something subtle begins to shift. You stop trying to erase the pattern and start recognizing when it appears. In real time, a familiar reaction rises, but this time it doesn't take over completely. Pauses, even if just for a second. And in that second, there is a choice. Not always a perfect one. Not always the one you hoped for, but a choice that didn't exist before. This is how the cycle begins to loosen, not by force, but by interruption, because patterns rely on continuity, on moving from trigger to reaction without awareness. But once awareness enters, the flow is disrupted, and disruption, even in small amounts, changes the structure over time. You begin to notice the moments before the reaction, the tension building, the discomfort rising, and instead of immediately responding, you sit with it, even briefly. That brief pause becomes a new experience, one your mind is not used to, but slowly it begins to learn something different. That discomfort does not always require the same response. That vulnerability does not always need to be avoided. That silence can be chosen, not just inherited. This is where separation begins. Not from your parents as people, but from the patterns you once believed were inseparable from you. You start to see the difference between origin and identity, between what was learned and what is chosen. And this distinction is quiet, but powerful, because it allows you to hold both truths at once. That something came from them, but does not have to define you. This is not rejection. It is integration, a process where you no longer fight what exists within you, but understand it enough to reshape it, without shame, without urgency, because urgency often comes from fear, and fear, as you've seen, keeps the cycle alive. But understanding slows everything down, creates space, and in that space, new responses begin to form. Not instantly, not perfectly, but consistently. Over time, those small moments of pause, those slight shifts in response, begin to accumulate, like drops of water reshaping stone. And one day, without realizing exactly when it happened, you respond differently, not because you forced it, but because something inside you changed its rhythm. The old pattern still exists, but it no longer leads. And that is how cycles break. Quietly, without announcement, without certainty, just slowly becoming something else. For a long time, the fear felt like a warning, a signal to stay alert, to watch yourself closely, to make sure you didn't cross an invisible line. But over time, something changes. The fear softens, not because the patterns disappear, but because your relationship with them does. You begin to realize something that once felt impossible. You were never meant to become someone else. Not your parents. Not the opposite of them. Just yourself. And that self is not built from rejection. It is shaped through awareness. Through the quiet understanding of what exists within you and what you choose to do with it. Because the truth is, you may carry pieces of them in your voice, in your reactions, in the way you process the world. But carrying something is not the same as being defined by it. And this is where freedom begins. Not in becoming completely different, but in becoming conscious. Conscious of what you repeat. Conscious of what you change. Conscious of what you allow to continue. You are not a fixed outcome of your past. You are an evolving response to it. And evolution doesn't erase where you came from, transforms how it lives within you. So the question slowly shifts from, am I becoming them, to something quieter. Who am I becoming despite them, and because of them? And in that question, there is no fear, only curiosity, because identity is no longer something you defend. It becomes something you discover, moment by moment, choice by choice, not perfectly, but honestly. And maybe, in the end, that's what this fear was trying to protect. Not your distance from them, but your closeness to yourself. A self that is aware, a self that reflects, a self that feels deeply and still chooses differently. And that is not something to fear. It is something quietly powerful. If this video made you feel seen, if parts of this reflection felt uncomfortably familiar, if something quiet inside you was touched, then know this gently. You are not alone in this experience. Many carry the silent weight of patterns they didn't choose, and the quiet fear of becoming something they once struggled to understand. But the fact that you notice, the fact that you question, already sets something apart within you. If you'd like to stay connected to reflections like this, a space where the hidden corners of the human mind are explored with honesty and care, you're welcome to stay. And if you feel comfortable, you can share your thoughts below. Not because you have to, but because sometimes your words might help someone else feel a little less alone in theirs. Take care of yourself. You deserve gentleness.